A mission so secret, it was part of another secret mission, and any sailors involved were not fully informed. Operation Ivy Bells was an attempt to wiretap the communication lines of the Russian military during the Cold War. The operation was a joint effort by the NSA, CIA, and the U.S. Navy to gather intelligence about the Soviets' intercontinental ballistic missile and nuclear first strike capabilities. Divers from the specially prepared submarine USS Halibut exited their decompression chamber in the early 1970s to go on a daring and dangerous operation. In a time which already saw the tensions between the two world powers rising, the U.S. had learned about the deep-sea communication cables in the Soviet Union's territorial waters, which were strictly off-limits for foreign vessels. The mission was exceptionally daring, since multiple surface and subsurface exercises were conducted at any given time, and the Soviet Navy had installed sound detection devices to detect intruders. This made getting anywhere near the cables an already seemingly impossible task. This did not hold them back. Nearly 400 feet beneath the freezing waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, deep within Soviet territorial waters, the divers were only kept alive by umbilical cords that pumped warm water into their diving suits. These divers probed the ocean's surface for a 5-inch diameter cable, transmitting secret Soviet communication between military locations in an attempt to even out the Cold War balance and gain the upper hand. The challenges. James F. Bradley Jr. was appointed Undersea Warfare Director for the United States Office of Naval Intelligence in 1966. He oversaw the mission that deployed the USS Halibut to search the Pacific for downed Soviet submarine K-129 in 1968. Bradley assumed the Petropavlovsk facility was linked to the mainland via an unencrypted telephone line connection. He reasoned that because Soviet cryptographers were known to be overworked and military officials needed quick communication, they had buried an undersea cable so deep into their territory in the sea and near to Russia's shore that they believed nobody would get access to it. His first challenge was to find a method to fund an expedition to locate and tap the cable. The United States Navy was working on a Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle (DSRV) program in 1970, which was a vehicle capable of rescuing submariners in case an accident happened. The Navy diverted funding from this program and outfitted the Halibut with what seemed to be a DSRV vehicle, but was actually a diver lockout known as the Bat Cave, from which divers could exit the submarine. The second problem was figuring out how to keep divers at 400 feet for the many hours it would take to place a wiretap on the cable. Helium was the answer. We breathe a combination of around 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen at the surface. Captain George F. Bond of the U.S. Navy had been experimenting with gases that would allow divers to reach considerably greater depths and stay there for extended periods of time since the 1950s. When the nitrogen and oxygen in our blood are squeezed by water pressure, the nitrogen builds up, causing nitrogen necrosis, decompression sickness, which could be fatal when decompression is done too quickly. The divers in Operation Ivy Bells would breathe helium alongside oxygen instead of nitrogen. This was one of the very first applications of saturation diving. Because helium has a smaller molecular weight than nitrogen, it would not make the divers feel drunk, but would allow them to think more clearly. The next challenge was finding the Soviet cable in over 600,000 square miles of water. The answer came to him while he was remembering his childhood on the Mississippi River. He remembered signs being posted on the shore, which warned fishermen not to anchor because there were utility lines at the bottom of the river. The captain reasoned that if they used those signs in America, the Russians would use something similar. When the Halibut arrived in the Sea of Okhotsk in October 1971, the crew inspected the shoreline and discovered signs advising fishermen to avoid the area where the cable had been buried. The Soviets had no idea that enemy subs could get near enough to read the signals, or that they would have technology to send divers strolling on so deep a bottom. It took just a few days to discover the cable after the search area was limited. The last hurdle to take was to figure out how to connect to the cable without shorting it out. His answer was introduction. A wiretapping device, 20 feet long, was created to wrap around the 5-inch thick wire without penetrating its protective case. In addition, the device was designed to slip off if the cable was ever elevated for repair. He also needed a method to divide the channels so that someone could comprehend what was being said, of which the methods are still classified. The mission. The mission was a go in October 1971, and the Navy needed a good reason for their presence in Russian territories. What they presumably came up with was that the halibut was sent on a search and recovery mission, although the exact communication is still classified. It's not entirely sure how this would be allowed by the USSR at the time where tensions were high between the two. The specifically outfitted USS Halibut was sent deep into the Sea of Okhotsk with the DSRV simulator on board, as previously noted. The divers were able to use this device, under the false presumptions, to ensure a safe exit out of the submarine. Eventually, the divers working from the Halibut found the cable at 400 feet depth, where they installed the device. This device recorded all communications that were transmitted over the line, and each month, the divers from the Navy took the tapes from the device, which held the recordings, and installed a new set of tapes. After recording as much information as physically possible, the Halibut returned to America. Upon receiving the tapes, NSA intelligence analyzed the recordings for vital information and found that most of the sensitive details were completely unencrypted. The Halibut's tapes proved to be invaluable in gaining the upper hand over the Soviets. NSA cryptologists uncovered a wealth of private information, from Soviet submarine operations and ballistic missile development plans to personal phone calls and messages to loved ones. The Soviets, unaware of their tapped communication lines, were handing their most well-guarded secrets to them on a silver platter. With this influx of foreign intelligence, the U.S. would be able to continue negotiating peace with the Soviets. This intel was then analyzed by NSA and CIA employees and was proven an invaluable treasure worth of information. As part of their mission, they recovered more than 2 million pieces of missile debris, which were taken back to the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory for reverse engineering purposes. After they successfully reconstructed it, the Navy discovered that the missile had been guided by radar and not by infrared as they assumed earlier. The mission was so successful that a nuclear-powered wiretap was created, and other submarines began monitoring Soviet undersea cables around the world using similar tactics. For almost 10 years, the wiretapping efforts were a great success, until disaster struck. They went unnoticed until 1981, when monitoring satellites revealed a number of Soviet vessels, including a recovery ship, anchored over the underwater cable. USS Parch, another intelligence-capable submarine, was quickly dispatched to the spot to retrieve the device. When the Parch drivers were unable to locate the tap, they realized that the operation had been detected by the Soviets. This left American commanders to puzzle about how the Soviets had suddenly spotted the wiretap. They would later on learn how their seemingly so successful operation was uncovered. Ronald Pelton, a 44-year-old NSA employee, found he was deeply in debt in January 1980. Pelton stepped into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and for the following 5 years sold information regarding signals intelligence to the Soviets, including information on Operation Ivy Bells, for a total of $35,000 plus cost. The U.S. was taken by surprise when, in 1981, U.S. surveillance satellites showed a flotilla of Soviet ships, including a salvage vessel, sitting right above the site of the wiretap. The submarine USS Parch was dispatched to recover the tap, but they found that the Soviets had already taken it. When Pelton's source, a KGB colonel named Vitaly Yurchenko, defected to America in July 1985, the reason for the tap was disclosed. Yurchenko informed U.S. authorities about Pelton's espionage, which resulted in his arrest and a 30-year prison sentence. He was released in 2015. The U.S. device has now been put on display at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Moscow, where it is immortalized for its ingenuity and sophistication for the time.